Given that the COVID pandemic has really caused a lot of harm to state revenue, with New York State believing that tax revenue can plummet 68%, I do want to talk about what kind of financial impact it's going to have on states that are already in very precarious situations. Laurence, let's start with Illinois here, given that it's kind of the poster child here for some of the distress even before some of these coronavirus issues came into play.
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Sonali, and certainly interesting times in muni markets across the board, from high grade into high yield and into stressed and distressed situations, which we focus on. You know, Illinois has been quite the topic of conversation even before the crisis, as you mentioned. Very challenged to borrow at efficient levels. You just look at the markets. For example, Illinois is issuing debt just under the 6% all-in yield. By way of comparison, Michigan or Connecticut are in the 2.5% range, and so debt already is expensive for Illinois. Now, it's important to keep in mind that a big state issuer like Illinois has tools available to it for downturns and challenges. So they can raise taxes, they could reduce services by cutting expenses, etc. They could access some government programs, and we don't know what's coming, but that really is out of their control. And so this will be one to follow. Illinois had problems pre-crisis. I would say those problems are pronounced post-crisis through two main drivers: increased costs, providing health care, etc., and reduced revenues, less activity, less income, less taxes. And so that will be a tough situation, we think.
There is a prospect here that has been raised in the middle of this crisis, and however unlikely, I still want to ask you your opinion on any sort of likelihood of a state going bankrupt. And if not a state, then what besides a state in the U.S. might be in such a stretched financial condition here that it would have to file for bankruptcy?
Well, I think, as a preliminary matter, you have to keep in mind the structure of the muni market and how different muni bonds are dealt with. So at the highest level, the apex issuer is the large state issuer. By the way, prohibited from filing Chapter 9, so there would have to be some other resolution in place to administer an insolvency proceeding. But states, those issuers have lots of tools at their disposal. I mentioned raising taxes, reducing services, accessing stimulus, etc. And so we think it's likely out of the money to see a large state file for bankruptcy, certainly within the next year or so. But I'll point something out that I find interesting. The credit default swap market, which attempts to handicap the risk of a default, would tell you that, for example, Illinois is a credit that could be compared to maybe Vietnam or Pakistan, or if you like, South Africa or Turkey, Brazil, Guatemala. These are credits where the CDS rates imply the likelihood of a default within 5 years. For example, Illinois currently reads at a 67% likelihood of default. Now, if you're asking me, do I believe that? That's a different question, but the market is telling you something.
So speaking of, another thing you had mentioned once to me before is if not Illinois or not a whole state going bankrupt, although that CDS point is enormously interesting. In the nearer term, what about housing authorities, airport authorities, counties, anything less than a state?
Yeah, that's where sort of the rubber hits the road. So I mentioned that states have a multitude of tools at their disposal. Not similar to states, the asset-backed portion of the muni market, called the revenue bond market, is often secured by a singular asset and the proceeds from that asset, like a senior care facility, a housing facility, student housing facility, infrastructure asset, etc. Their tools for coping with downturns, irregularities like the one we're facing, are much more limited. That's an area we specialize in. And again, I would say credit work around investing in those sorts of project finance bonds, revenue-backed bonds, is very important, more important today than it ever has been.